process. So in the American play, obviously that did not happen, but it was also not because the Americans didn't have agitprop theatre at that point, they had it and they already started to be sick of it. So they were looking for more sophisticated ways, I think, to join a psychological portrayal of characters with a kind of political story. And when Brecht came because he wasn't happy with the translation that he'd seen, and he'd actually traveled to New York in 35, and he writes on the boat to New York, he writes, oh, am I going to be like, he thinks he'll be openly embraced. He thinks it's like the most modern place. This is a place he always wanted to be. He always had a fetish for fast cars and boxing and popular culture, and he thinks it would be great. And he comes there and they totally disagree, and he proceeds to completely butcher the play, and it fails horribly on those grounds. But actually, you know, when we work with the actors, the American actors were working with Stanislavski exercises, and the actors in the German parts were working with Brechtian exercises, and what you see is essentially actors rehearsing for real and thinking about how to do this without any kind of, you know, direction to make it particularly this way or that.
But it seems there's a very different sense of identification with the text, that it's with the kind of American version of the mother, it's a kind of sense of finding motivations, finding a kind of a personal relation to the text in order to be able to convey it. Whereas on the flip side, the Berlin version is much more about a kind of distancing in order to engage in political discourse, or the kind of sense that it relates particularly to reality rather than to some kind of fiction.
Yeah, I mean, in America, basically Waiting for Lefty had just come out and was a huge success, and that was the first attempt to do a kind of political play that would involve the audience and kind of, and I think that's what the Union Theatre tried to do with this performance. But what happened in Berlin, actually, interestingly, is that the play got rewritten a lot. So this discussion about this one character who dies and whether he should be holding the flag and whether he's a reformist or not, and, you know, whether to side with the kind of more center-left kind of workers or not, actually became like meant that the play continued to be rewritten in response to reviews and political discussions that people were having around the time. But then at the same time, when it was playing in the normal Berlin theatre, it was sort of, in a way, unimpeded by censorship. It was the last play that Brecht performed before leaving Germany when the Nazis came to power. But Helen Weigel described this performance that they did in this working class club that you also see as their most successful performance. And what's really interesting there is what actually happens is that although the play wasn't directly censored, the police came and said, well, because of fire regulations, you can't really do this. You can't use props, you can't use sets, you can't, you know, and during the performance, the police kind of continued to intervene and negotiate with the actors. So the actual drama became that negotiation with the police. And the actual enjoyment, I think, for the audience became, according to Helen Weigel's account, actually that kind of standoff. And so what ultimately could have been probably quite a boring play for a lot of people became really exciting. Not because necessarily it was politically so provocative, but because there was a policeman in the audience. So it's kind of interesting to see that a police officer in the audience could become the actual catalyst to drive this performance into something more exciting and more real and more captivating at that point. So we were also interested in that, because obviously Brecht tries all the time to, at least with the plays from that period, to collapse that distinction and to let the play move into real political action. And that's when it actually happens, but it's not because the actors try to raise the consciousness of the working class, which is obviously what they're thinking they're doing, but because actually this asshole turns up and a whole different level of drama ensues from that.
I mean, maybe Andrea, you could, just in terms of your relation to your own work and this kind of idea of identification with a text, or the potential within the kind of rehearsing or kind of reciting of a text and its relation to contemporary, like a historical text and its relation to contemporary events.
I mean, what's been interesting for me to just comment on seeing this film is this, that when I was looking at it again, like this question of like we're watching Brechtian methodologies, but we are of course also watching Anja and David's methodologies. So there's this, and I was trying to kind of dissect those things a little bit, because there's a lot of strategy in which there's this, one can totally get lost in the narrative and just think about Brecht, but I think there's also the way in which there's this constant repetition of scenes, of ideas, how they're presented. Now, you just told me also characters, actors repeating, playing different characters. And I think it's this, the thing that stays constant somehow is the text through it, which I find really interesting as a way then that gets kind of traveled or communicated across all these different levels and registers of history until it arrives, in my lap as a viewer. So I think this is within a kind of film video world. It's interesting how, because we're also talking about this idea of the difference, what happens, there's no direct address, for example, in your film, which I think is very important that there isn't. And that was taken out of some of the plays. And so the way I think in which I arrive at it as a viewer, as a political reality, is a different kind of delay than, let's say, some of the work that I've recently done. And the project, the three of us have talked about, is Comrades of Time, which exists. There's a video version of it, which I think has some similar strategies, but then there's also the performance where you strip the media away and you put the performer, which I did basically as an experiment as part of everything by Anja last year, this year, where I just stripped the media and the medialization away in a certain way and put the characters into the crowd and with a direct address and something. It's interesting because it I think calls out a very immediate reflection and emotion in people. It's more effective, but also if you look at it phenomenologically or psychologically, it also kind of, this directness sometimes closes people off, or gets them uncomfortable, or gets them emotional in one particular way, where the filmic, I think, creates a certain kind of distance that allows a different kind of reflection. So I've been interested in that, the role of the way in which the address gets media away from it.
I mean, I guess that comes full circle in the way to the first question, because the way I read Polly, in a sense, is that there's a heavy emphasis on the site of production, not necessarily the site of viewing so much, in that you're so engaged with an awareness of a kind of group of people, a group of amateurs, or who are kind of rehearsing or working within a kind of narrative and a script that is clearly related to kind of some level of close experience. There's a proximity there to personal experience, and that's where it pivots in a sense. But then within this kind of more cinematic, which is definitely the progression within the work, it becomes a more distance theorizing around these kind of, I don't know whether that distance is perhaps what we're talking about here.
I think the attention just generally shifts more to looking at how we construct, or how a world is represented to us. I mean, that's obviously, I guess that's the sort of most significant contribution of people like Brecht and Stanislavski and also Meisner to theatre. They had very kind of particular visions of what a person is and how a person relates to the world around them. And I think based on that kind of initial construction, your options for political agency contract or expand in different ways. And I mean, I think there were two things for me, basically. I think one is like looking at how they construct characters and what they want from them and how they think they should be doing things. And I think this sort of moment in Brecht where he feels that he talks about new socially productive emotions, which is obviously highly questionable, and is also questioned in the film by Ruth Berlau, what socially productive actually would mean. But he's essentially saying if we had new circumstances, if our circumstances change, then we will have new emotions. So what he tried to do with the theatre was present situations that were kind of contemporary situations. And he thought that these kind of new types of feelings would kind of almost organically merge out of them. So whereas Stanislavski takes you back to what is perceived as sort of primal or fundamental emotions or kind of experiences that are actually in the actor's past. So in a way, there's a sort of replication of what we assume are the most basic human emotions, whether it's like fear or love or desire or, you know, hatred or whatever. So, and I think Brecht tries to kind of get out of this by provisionally, as he says, leaving the emotions out. And that's one thing. But then the other thing, I mean, which I think is with Comrades in Time also, which I found incredibly moving to actually watch recently. And I mean, the funny thing is, I mean, I guess these works were made like, you know, a couple of years back, but we were just talking about how they seem increasingly relevant suddenly with all the things that have been happening around us, and then also David and me have been living and working in Greece for the last year, so this kind of weird sort of Weimarish kind of political kind of very explosive sort of political situation, these kind of discussions suddenly I start seeing them in a very different light in retrospect. But what also is important is that repetition of the text. And what was fascinating to me was that there you have a play that's sort of first written in 31 or 32, and then that continues to be performed in, you know, New Deal America, in the GDR, in completely like vastly different political context, and it's the same text, but in each context it means something else. So there's a limit to the intention of the playwright that's set by historical circumstances, and that will in certain moments allow the play to be more progressive, and in other moments it will actually make it potentially completely reactionary. I mean, in the GDR, the idea of this play was, when it was restaged, the intention behind it was certainly for the sort of GDR culture functionaries, with obviously the East German population was still, the Russians were the occupying force. Just after the war, they were sort of hated. So this idea was to kind of rehumanize the Russian people by pointing to their revolutionary past. So it was a kind of ameliorating sort of staging that was essentially supposed to prepare people to accept Soviet influence over their lives.
I mean, what's interesting for me is to think about the role, you know, if I think of myself as an artist and somebody making things, and I think myself historically backwards, you know, and Brecht being in that moment of trying to respond to this very different time unraveling back there. I was just thinking, when we were talking about, I cannot help, I think there's some people in the audience who were there too, but there was a lecture today, in part of the performance seminar, around where Judith Butler talked about this idea of that she's not interested in the new emotion anymore, but we're at a place where we need to undeaden our own emotional horizons. And I was just thinking about this idea between of Brecht and this time, where there was actually a need for a new emotion because there was a complete restructuring of society that preceded these plays that he was writing. And he really comes into consciousness as an adult during the time of this reordering, and I think it's really interesting in these plays. So for us then, doing this work right now, I wonder how I can arrive at a good question to you about that. But I think there's one cannot help but think about what is the role of art. Is there an artistic form of knowledge? The question that is asked in the film. And what would that be without art being instrumentalized for a political ideology, even though today we don't, at least in our sphere, the ideology is not that clear. It's not that, we have yet failed to build an ideology we could actually attach ourselves to as a political struggle, I think. So, I don't know, could you talk a little bit about, in terms of how you circulate the film, I don't know, it's a difficult question. I don't know if you know where I want to go, but this way in which the way you and I maybe use the space of a public that art produces as a space to think about politics. I know, it's a very hard question. It's a big thing. It's kind of relevance of art. What can art do in this larger political sphere, in this larger political dialogue, and why do we fall, as I said, between the three of us, why can't we get away from Brecht in a certain way? You address him as a theme, but I think I was also really very much thinking about Yvonne Weiner's film Journeys from Berlin, which is this really struggle with this dialogue that is kind of evolving through the film, these two lines of narrative between a personal revolution and a political revolution, and how they collide in one person. So we're using these methods that he gave us, send us along with, but then also we're adapting them, I guess, to the current crisis that we're in.
I think for David and I, when we made this, there was just a sense that, just talks of specifically reflecting on kind of the use of Brecht in art generally, that there was a kind of sort of repeated going back to Brecht and through principally formal trademarks of Brecht, the blank address to the viewer, the breaking the fourth wall, the kind of the delivery without emotion, which I think generally, particularly in artist film and video, has become sort of convention, because you don't want to have affect or emotions or cheesy sentimentality or whatever, and that's sort of always signified a kind of criticality, but actually it has just become the form in which to package it. So one thing was to kind of try and get rid of this idea that this particular formal inventions by Brecht were necessarily still functioning in the same way as they did when he invented them, and that they were not forms that could be endlessly recycled. And even if you look at the early Brecht, he never intended it. He says, new times ask for new forms, and these have to be constantly revised. And even with the late Brecht, when he archives his stuff, I think there's a sense in which he says, this is for future generations to see where we got to before we failed, essentially. So it's an archiving of his own achievements, but it's by no means a kind of sense of, oh yeah, guys, this is where you should carry on from, necessarily. So,
don't you think it's also this moment, I'm curious what your thoughts are, that it is in this moment of return that is also a complete disillusionment, right, with the loss of his friends and the kind of despair that people had returning to Germany, and East Germany particularly, after the war, both Germanys. And that maybe the archiving is also kind of an attempt to hold on to the reality of that struggle that they were trying to fight, right? That it's kind of a desperate reflex to hold on to what he believed in as relevant or truth or.
I mean, the interesting thing is there were a lot of different reactions. If you look at all the playwrights, artists, actors, musicians, whatever, that he was affiliated with, that shared a common sort of aesthetic and political project in the Weimar period, which also, you know, you draw a lot on these texts in your piece. It's really interesting when we showed the work in Stuttgart at the Staatsgalerie. They actually allowed us to select some works from their archives to show alongside the film. And we went through their archives and dragged out work by contemporaries of Brecht, like from you know, people like George Gross to Schlichter and so on and so forth. So there was a whole group of artists that all had also written quite extensively, that had been part of small artistic and political circles, that had also published collective texts, how to respond to the crisis and the increasing, you know, right-wing kind of rise of the fascists. And all of them responded quite differently after the war. The ones that survived, I mean, you get these retreats into art as, again, fully autonomous. You get retreats into mysticism and Catholicism, which is also what Brecht references. You get people like George Gross arriving in New York and she expressing an outright hatred of the masses, like almost like a complete reversal of his prior writing. And you sort of wonder, in a way, what was it in their political ambitions? And I think this was the important thing for me and David at this point, was like, on the one hand, seeing that what you hope to achieve and what your intentions are, and whether they succeed or not is not just a personal success or failure. It depends on the larger historical context, whether these things be a fruit or they turn out in another way, but also what your intentions are and the ways you define what your art is, sets you up in some sense for like failures or political backwardness that only really comes out after the war and after the defeat, in whether these people are sort of able to carry on or not. And I'm not talking about, obviously a lot of people for psychological reasons could not deal with it, which I totally respect. I don't understand how anyone could live through this period without wanting to commit suicide or go mad in some sense. But on the other hand, you know, you see with Brecht, I think you see a kind of, he limits himself. He goes, well, I've done all this shit, and it hasn't, you know, things, time hasn't, history hasn't done what I wanted it to do. And I'm going to concentrate on the theatre now. And it's a retreat back into a purely artistic context. And it's definitely, for me, a retreat, although I wouldn't say that's, you know, what else could you do? I mean, really, but it's sort of interesting to see the things he assumed. I mean, I think the most problematic thing with what he assumes is that there was still this kind of quite sort of Leninist idea of artists as avant-garde and artists as being able to raise the consciousness of the masses, and that was somehow important, and then the masses would kind of, you know, catch on to that, and I think that's something that's like a deeply problematic idea within leftist politics in general, the idea that the kind of intellectuals or artists are somehow ahead rather than behind what's going on the streets. So yeah.
Yeah, there were. there was somebody in the art world who, in the midst of Occupy Wall Street a year ago, like posted on his Facebook page that, you know, it's because of the artists that we have Occupy Wall Street, and I was thinking, wow, it's a pipe dream. And I mean, we were very involved. Lots of artists, of course, are incredibly involved in Occupy Wall Street, and that was really great. But it wasn't the leading force. It was just one group, I think, that was involved. One thing I wanted to just comment on that I find very helpful in the film, or I identify also with as an artist, is you know, that the making of the work itself is also a figuring out of one's political stance in relationship to something or to a historic moment. I think, I mean, if I dissect the film, I can get a sense of your relationship to Hollywood. I can get a sense of your relationship to certain aspects of Brecht. Like, and I find that something that gets not, that we don't talk so much as artists about, is this way in which the work allows us to think through what the larger ideological and political questions are that we're faced with, and that we as, you know, semi-public figures can put out there in our work. I mean, we were talking earlier about this idea of the letter writing, and that's something that I use a lot for my scripts as a base, is letter exchanges, because especially in that time period, that was the moment I feel where people were really trying to identify their own beliefs or figuring them out collectively. I think actually the text that was made me start working on Comrades of Time was a letter exchange between Benjamin and Adorno, which I think started in 1923 and lasted until Benjamin died. And I think there's something interesting as a forum that I have kind of envy, like cross-historical envy, is this way through the letter exchange, they're basically constantly critiquing each other's works, and they're also like realizing that this image of the bourgeoisie, or the Bürgertum, the bourgeoisie, would not survive this time, and they were realizing that their own kind of environment was dismantling, and that they were also okay with that, actually, but they had to, they needed to kind of find this larger political project that they were needed to fight for because of the crisis that they were faced with, through this back and forth of a critique of each other's work and a commitment to each other's idea, through the process of a singular address writing process, you know, that we don't have so much anymore, and that I mean, we have it in emails, and people, I mean, blogs are different because I think they're not this very particularized address. So I was just thinking about that, really, and seeing the film, that it is a space where I feel you share that kind of thinking through this political moment.
Yeah, I think that's also interesting. I mean, one of the most curious elements of the film is this kind of moment of montage of personal crisis.
Of the drama.
The drama moment, and the dramatizing of this relationship with Ruth Barlow, particularly. And that seems like really interesting, because it's the moment when you realise this is a construction in a way. It's a complete construction of fabrication of your sense of a relationship, and how that both occurred as a political exchange, but also had this deeply kind of emotional quality to it, and it's, you know, it's underlying up until that point, and then you really play it over the top. And I wonder, maybe you can say something about that particular focus on Ruth Berlau, particularly, and her role in relation to Brecht's thinking, but also his notion of affect.
Well, it's kind of twofold, sort of fact and fiction. I mean, it certainly also was because, I mean, obviously David can't be here tonight because he was here, but then he had a flight to go back to London, and because of the postponement of the dates, he can't be with us. But you know, we've worked together for several years, and our process is very much a process of exchange and discussion going into these projects. And actually, when we made this film, we argued for about 6 months while putting it together about what should go into it and what shouldn't. I mean, we've both been researching the kind of parts that we were interested in, so we weren't necessarily always reading the same books. David would read something, I would read something, and then we would sort of summarize for each other what we thought was most relevant. But David was adamant that he really wanted the film to just consist of these actors in rehearsal, working with Brechtian and Stanislavskian techniques, and that was really his interest. And I was completely obsessed with Hollywood and these kind of connections between, like all these kind of exiles. Because I mean, I don't know how well that's known generally, but in LA at this time you have Thomas Mann, you have Schönberg, you have Heinrich Mann, you have Adorno, you have Brecht, you have Hans Eisler, you have Fritz Lang, Salke Viertel. I mean, you have all these kind of characters from the German intelligentsia that somehow found themselves there. And although they totally bitched about each other, they at the same time ended up constantly at each other's barbecues and poring over each other's work and actually producing quite similar work. If you go and look at Leon Feuchtwagen's book about Geyer, if you look at Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, if you look at Adorno's kind of writing on aesthetics, if you look at what Brecht did during this period, you see that there's a constant sense of themes re-emerging and of a dialogue between these people that is not always publicly around, but there is a huge sense also of this, which I think we try to sort of hint at with some of the images in the film. There's a huge sense of going back to something medieval, or where the medieval or the kind of the image of the Inquisition and so on and so forth becomes the sort of dominant image, being sucked back from a kind of that sort of euphoric moment of the early 20th century of a progress somehow into an image of kind of horror and backwardness. I think it's really important. I mean, I really found that also watching Comrades of Time and the way you kind of basically re-edited these texts into kind of monologues. This sort of flipping between talking about politics and talking about deeply personal, whether it's love dramas or anxieties or nightmares or whatever, is a kind of form that I think within, particularly the letter, but also people's diaries from that time, and then also these exchanges that obviously are not recorded, must have occurred all the time. It's constantly reflected in the writing. Brecht's kind of way of dealing with it is that he doesn't deal with it at all in his plays, although he deals with it in his poetry. So I think you have, this is not what we're dealing with is a very prolific person and not even an individual, but a collective, I think. And what you get in this film is a very specific focus that focuses around his thoughts on theatre. But I guess this is something that we keep asking ourselves, and these are sort of questions that are also coming up again in people's works right now. It's like what actually, and that Eva Reiner, for example, who's also very, very deeply influenced by Brecht, is kind of, I think, one of the very, very, geniuses at teasing out. It's like how far do we know our desires, and how far is our own emotional kind of and psychological world influencing our bigger political decisions, even if you don't think of them as being connected. And if you don't want to go for the sort of Stanislavskian or Meisner kind of model of the subject, and you want to kind of in a way stay with this tradition. I mean, it's not just Brecht, it's also the people that he looked at. I mean, he loved Bruegel, he loved, you know, and there was a whole tradition for him. Karl Valentin, the sort of comedian from the 1920s as well, from Germany. There was a lot of influences of sort of non-realist, realist work that he was drawn to, that you could trace pretty much throughout history. People who try to understand larger configurations of social and personal constellations. But if you want to kind of carry on that tradition, how do you get over that weird, it almost seems like a kind of blind spot in his work. That is his relationship with, his collaborators.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Because I would say though that the place of affect in Brecht is in the audience, right? Like that's where he wants to construct the emotion, not in the act, not on stage, but beyond stage. And I think he does talk about that, no? That he wants to, it's not enough to represent reality, but you want to represent it in a way that it, invigorates in the audience passion to do the things that the actors maybe hesitate doing. So I think it's just also the locale of the emotion and the affect.
Yeah, he wants. He's written very different things about that, but I think generally, I think if I would sort of try and say what my sort of understanding is, that the main thing with him is he wants to leave space for so these things, these blanks can be filled in, and he sees characters and audiences as much more fluid in that way, constructing themselves in the moment of performance. And he doesn't think it's necessary to fill in all the details. But he's very interested in kind of the ensemble or the constellation in general. So whereas I guess the Hollywood model as we know it now is like a constant, through the music, through the editing, through the performance, it's like a constant, like you cannot escape crying at, the most, even, the most ridiculous moments of, E.T. wanting to call Pope or something like that, even though it's like this weird brown rubber thing. So it's a kind of totally different, obviously it's a totally different kind of thing, but I think there's something in between these two. Yeah. And we need to find out what it is. If you want to move on in some way.
We can open it up to see if anybody's got any questions.
Yeah, Anja, what you were just saying comes across in parts of the film. Like the assumption is that if you're immersed in the naturalistic depiction of lives of subjects, then you're immersed in the kind of, almost like the things that are inadequate to making ideas and a kind of conscious sort of mapping of the political situation. If you're really immersed in the, I guess you'd call it like the individual or the kind of individual scale almost, you can't perceive the kind of meta scale, the kind of systemic scale of politics. That's really the kind of nub of this Brechtian concept, and versus the Stanislavskian, is that basically like you don't want to be sucked into someone's life or their emotions or any of those things that go with a life, because you need the space to think, right? And that's the problem in a way also. Like that's what's holding that type of theater back from like actually being able to find that middle point that you just talked about. Like between E.G. and Brecht, there's like another type of experience that, like Andrea, you were saying, our undeadening might allow us to access. And like watching this again, I realized that and hearing you speak about it, Anja, I realized how much Brecht was able to kind of imagine that he was imagining as a political projection. And it's that projection that seems like the kind of, like, I don't know, you really filled that in well, what his projection was like. But do you think that his projection, or that the way that he wanted a kind of plan, do you think this was the problem in a way? Like, without being able to find a kind of more of a trust in the subjectivity?
No, I mean, what's interesting for me is in this, the title of the film, The Empty Plan, comes from a passage in the Messenkauf Dialogues, which is a text that Brecht wrote as a kind of, I think before he wrote this much more kind of point-by-point books on the theatre in the sort of late 40s and early 50s, he basically tried to, in the late 30s and early 40s, write a piece about his theatre that would be a play, or could be performed as a play or a dialogue on a stage. And in that, it was never finished. It's a really interesting text, and it's also text that evolves. So the statements that are made at the beginning of the text are kind of completely, increasingly incongruous with things he says later on. And there's this one very intriguing passage, which obviously they also quote from at the end of the film, where he talks about this idea of empty planning. And where he talks about the relationship between knowledge and guessing in art. And he talks about, he actually says, thoughts can be felt and feelings can be thought. It's like the most sophisticated, it's a really surprising text for Brecht. It's like the most, from what I've come across, one of his most sophisticated and kind of obscure texts. And he talks about how some dreams turn into plans, and then also, you know, vice versa, you know, some dreams like remain in that realm. And he says literally, I'm no longer interested in planless dreaming, I'm interested in dreamless planning, a corresponding empty plan. And I mean, my sense of that was always that the ideological, I mean, that's why it seems so pertinent to the situation now. Like what you were saying, like we don't have this ideological framework anymore that these artists had. I mean, they're mainly obviously rallied around the sort of communist party at this point in the 30s, 20s and 30s. And there was a sort of larger ideological project that was actually carried by the working class as well, and a lot of their peers basically that permeated sort of all spheres of art and production activism. So I think for me it was a sort of sense of saying this ideological project is gone, but what do we want to do now? Do we want to retreat into a kind of a mysticism, like many of these artists actually ended up doing after the war, or do we want to kind of dream about utopian possibilities, or do we stay committed somehow to an idea that there could be, I guess, some idea of progress? I guess that's what a plan implies to me in that sense. There could be some way of shifting or reconfiguring social and economic conditions, but that would just be an intention that you would have to go towards, and you would have to figure out as you went along, because the possibility of this larger kind of, you know, revolutionary movement or ideological framework had also proved itself. I mean, through Stalinism and Russia and various other things, proved itself to be not what people wanted it to be, and as destructive also. So
yeah, I mean, that dreamless planning moment in the film, though, it did strike me as I don't know. It struck me as as missing something. Like, what about dreams and plans? Or,
I think it's an open question. I think the thing is, he's clearly saying they're guessing and speculation have a role in art,
yeah.
but there needs to be a tension between, once the tension snaps between knowledge and guessing or speculating, then art, the field becomes dead, essentially. And I think it's just it's kind of, I don't think he says don't dream, but he says, I'd rather be on this side than on the mystical utopian side in this moment.
Well, I think it would be interesting to ask you both about like this role that you're both taking on as artists in a way that's like trying to talk about a world that can change, and at the same time, like that whole prefiguration of the plan is kind of like, how does one deal with that on some level? It's something that, like, all of the kind of communist and other movements have obviously, like, as you're just saying, like they planned, but reality didn't turn out exactly as they did planned.
For me, there's something to say about that I feel what he's referring to is also this thing of that if you dream, or that you're in this mythology, or that you kind of have a fixed image that actually can't acknowledge the present, the kind of fragility of the present moment, and the constant kind of shift and change that real crisis requires. I think what's interesting for me is that in the moment Brecht is in exile is a very fragile and precarious moment where a lot of things, I think, that he was very kind of settled in, disappearing. There's this very interesting text by Brecht called Conversations Among Refugees, where he talks about, it's just like in the beginning, when he's just past Denmark and he's in Finland, when they realize, okay, this is not just going to end, they basically have to go on the run. He talks, there's these two characters sitting on a table, and they're like talking about how, when your citizenship is taken, like, there's nothing, all that's left for you is there to talk, there's no, so he's working, I think, that in America with this fragility of that he can't believe that there's like one utopian dream or one like thing that just like will show us the vision, but we have to empty ourselves out, basically. Where he then also says, I think you make him say in your film, like, he doesn't want to write about theater anymore, he wants to do theater. That it's time not to talk about revolution, but to actually do it through his own means of production, which is theater. And I think that's an interesting moment to consider for ourselves, in terms of the work not, we could start a whole conversation about this year's documenta in that regard. What kind of models of artistic practice are we believing in as artists right now? What is the role of art? And I think that Carolyn's project proposed a very particular kind of idea of what art can do in this crisis. And I know that there's many people that are extremely critical of that role of art, and we could spend the whole night if people want to stay and talk about that. It's a very interesting conversation in terms of like, where are we now? What is this role? Where is like our labor as artists most interestingly applied to within the conditions of crisis that we are in? We are in a crisis still here. Europe, and other places that I'm not as familiar with. So it's a good question to ask, I feel. And I don't have an answer, but I'm kind of with Brecht in this way that what does it take to actually remain open, to have this empty plan that kind of can move alongside with the conditions as they are changing, and as they have new requests for us. And that's why we had this, I don't know if people know this, but there's this, I think one of the exchanges also between him and Benjamin, because one of the things Benjamin said, I think just before he left in the late 30s, that somebody asked him, what is your favorite theorist or writer? And he said Scherbart, which was this like utopian, thinker. And Brecht got really mad about that, because it's like, we can't like go into these worlds, of utopian, of dreams, when we really need to stay right here, right now.
Thank you so much for your film. You show a lot about Brecht, but I sense that you also use strategies he proposed for his new theatre in your film, and I was wondering, could you elaborate a little bit on that, how you kind of incorporated his proposals for a new theatre in the way you edit it, or the way you tell your stories, or the way you shot your material? I'm just curious.
I mean, it was funny because we had a lot of discussions when we were writing it and sort of deciding how to essentially film it. It seemed like totally inane in a way to make a film about Brecht and then use Brechtian kind of strategies in some way. It seemed like a kind of sort of double statement or something that didn't really make sense. So hence we did decide quite deliberately no direct address and so on and so forth. There was quite consciously playing off different things against each other. So using the theatre to, in some sense, I mean, a lot of the scenes were largely improvised. There was cameras running all the time. There was always a kind of static camera that would give you a sort of audience POV, but then there was also cameras on stage, like following these discussions. So the theatre actually becomes the more immediate site, I guess, as a kind of viewing experience. Whereas everything that happens in exile essentially was done entirely by green screen in the studio. So there's a sort of weird confusion between these two orders. And then there's also, within that, I mean, in some way, constant embedded references, not just to Brecht, but also to other filmmakers that were heavily influenced by Brecht. So these kind of panning shots that are very much like what Geyer used a lot. The kind of, in a way, more like the scene with the astrologer is actually taken straight from a Fritz Lang movie from that time. So there's a lot of sort of embedded references and kind of also to use of back projection and stuff like that in Hollywood films. Pointing, I think, also to moments where even within that kind of much more commercial cinema, I think there's still a kind of level of, particularly with sort of, the European directors that started working there and noir and melodrama, there's actually still also quite a flexible, very interesting thing happening there, and I think still is happening in Hollywood productions to some extent, sometimes even unintentionally. So you get this Brechtian moment in the middle of, I don't know, Spider-Man, something like that, when things fall flat. I think this is much more how we know Brecht now. It sort of repeats itself in kind of illusionistic filmmaking in some funny form. And so I think the attempt was to kind of try and reference these two areas, the theatre and the make-believe kind of Hollywood thing, and bring them up in that way and work in these kind of references, rather than just trying to work in a Brechtian style. And I mean, it's also really interesting because I think when you, what people often forget, I think, was that I don't think we really know what these performances would have looked like anyway, or what Brecht really is like as a director. There's very few recordings from the GDR period, which is obviously already quite late on. But from the things that I've seen and heard, he was constantly commenting, he was totally neurotic, like shouting over the actors while they're talking, going, yeah, carry on, this is good, keep walking. It's like a football game, and it's like a performance of Galileo or something like that from 1950. A rehearsal that's being recorded in the Berlin Ensemble. So you get the sense you have a hugely emotional director, actually, and very kind of experienced and also very, very subtle actors, which is a huge emotional range. And And I think some of the reason why Brecht always says no emotion, no emotion, no emotion is actually because I think a lot of them actually brought that naturally to the situation by virtue of the times they lived through and the kind of people that they were and the way they worked together. So I think, like, yeah, that's also worth remembering, that there is a kind of uncertainty over, you know, he never wanted to write. I mean, he ended up writing theory. He always said, I'm not going to write theory, I'm not a theorist. I think he ended up writing it as a way of recording his experiments, but I think there's also not really a way for us to know quite how far they went or how complex they were.
I have maybe two, I don't know if we're ready to close, but I brought something to read. Yeah? Are you ready to close?